the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
The Stevens Institute of Technology is proud to present the Hugo New Corporation Sustainability Seminar Series, co-sponsored by Geocentric Consultants, H2M Architect Engineers, Brown & Codwell, and BEM Systems.
Thank you for the very, very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very pleased to see how many people are in the room. So this is like, it's going to be a little bit conversational. So don't expect to be wowed by the PowerPoint presentation. What I'm bringing this evening is something a little bit different. And if we, let's just see if I start using the slideshow correctly. Working with planners is really sort of the major topic here. And I think this is an important one because whether you know it or not, when you are addressing any of the issues of sustainability or resilience or any of these topics that relate to the social environs, the natural environment, built environment, and so forth, you are all sort of being trained as planners. And I understand that many people do graduate and expect to have very specific technical jobs. And so as I go through this presentation, when we finally talk about resilience projects and environmental review, I'm very deliberately drilling down to something very narrow that I do every day. But the point is, I want everyone to have sort of a concept of what it is to think broadly and to be developing relationships, professional relationships and interpersonal relationships, because I think that's really what is of value in terms of sustainability and the broad ideas that you are considering right now and the work that you'll be doing in the future. And I want to talk about the work that you won't necessarily be paid to do in the future. So this evening, as the course intro kind of mentioned, we're gonna talk about what planners do, because you will, even if you don't plan on becoming planners, and I'm not going to convert you into being planners, you will be working with planners. And the resilience projects and environmental review projects these are kind of typical first instances of engineers and planners working together. So we just want to get an idea of what planners do in the public sector and private sector. And we want to see the relationships between engineers and planners. And we'll talk about what environmental review is, because sometimes this very narrow topic, people assume that this is all that there is to environmental review. And it's not. It's all we're going to talk about until we talk about everything else. So again, I want everyone to be thinking broadly, and I want people to be cognizant of this idea that you can be willing to change your mind. And this means what you want to do professionally, how you pursue jobs, how you develop your career, ideas you encounter, new ideas, new technology, what even constitutes problems to be solved by engineers. And again, working in teams, collaboration, and really thinking outside the work that you're going to be paid to do every day. So this is the long-winded introduction that you sort of you don't need to read that. But what I'm going to tell you is that when I started school, I thought I was going to be an architect. So I started out in the Bachelor of Architecture program. And I realized that all my friends, so I grew up in a very small town in western Kansas, and I got to go to college, and I was very excited about that. And all my friends were talking about philosophy and psychology and Western Civ. And I was in this very focused, very narrow program of architecture. It was a very good program, but I wasn't getting to study any of these things that I sort of intuitively thought, those are the things that matter to architecture. Those are the things about people, the things about place, and I wasn't really getting to study that. So that's why I switched the degree to the Bachelor of Arts. Then I was afraid to graduate, and I said, well, maybe environmental studies is the way to go, so I pursued another degree. And then somewhere in the middle of that, I had a great mentor, Viktor Papinek, who, I don't know if anybody's familiar with his work. There was a show at the New School recently, but he was a designer, an industrial designer, who was very much at the forefront of advocating design for people. What at the time might have been called, back when I was in school, green design, recycling, renewable, low waste, reusable, making good design accessible to everyone equitably around the country, but around the world. And so these were concepts that sort of resonated with me and led me to the idea of planning. This idea that, oh, I can study people, and I can study places, and I can study issues of equity and environmental issues, and I can study it all together as part of planning. So he was kind of the one who nudged me into the study of urban planning, and it's been an interesting ride, and we're going to hear about that a little bit. So this evening, we're going to talk first about public sector and private sector planning, so that we understand there's kind of two realms in which, when planners graduate, they're going to work either in the public sector, working for a government agency, or they're going to work in a private sector, like I do right now, and what the differences are. And we're going to talk about specifically me, the environmental planner, well, my experience as an environmental planner. And we're going to drill down, as I said, and talk about environmental review. And I don't expect anyone to leave here wanting to do environmental review, maybe, but I want people to be familiar with what it is and what it isn't. And then we're going to get into our sample project. And the sample project's a good one because I think a month ago you had a speaker, Michael Tumulty, who was my colleague on the exact same project, Coney Island Yard. So I'm going to be offering you an entirely different perspective. He would have shown you, I haven't had a chance to speak to him or see his session, but I'm sure he would have told you all about the innovative technological solutions that were explored. We're going to approach it purely from environmental review. Then we're going to have a little summary, and then there's some homework. And there actually is some homework. I can't assign you homework, but it's homework. You should probably do it. So then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Now, again, this is conversational, so if anyone has trouble hearing me or just wants me to back up, let me know. We can do that. So I want to first just get an idea of who is in the room. So I'm just going to ask questions and just have you raise your hands. Who is currently seeking a graduate degree? Wow, okay. Undergraduate? Okay. How many engineers either have engineering degrees, expect to be engineers? Okay. Architects? No architects? Planners? Others? What are a couple of these others? What are you in the back?
Well, I'm retired now, but I engage in it now.
Okay. And you?
I'm a postdoctoral fellow. My degree is in environmental science.
Okay. So there was one over here, another over here. Yes.
I work as an environmental consultant.
Okay. So some of you are already working right now and doing school at the same time. How many of you are in that situation? Okay. And for those of you who are not in that situation, in terms of graduating, and getting a job, developing your career, even the ones who already have their careers. I'm curious about your number one concerns. I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to ask three of you. Number one concerns.
I see no plausible path from taking the extracurricular work that I do on campus and paving a career out of it. My background is actually in organizational behavior. A lot of people don't realize that. And so I have to figure out how am I going to take my background in leadership and in group behavior and dynamics, and somehow do I have to compromise that and learn machine learning, so on and so forth, in order to get a job.
Okay. That's quite an in-depth and rigorous explanation, and I appreciate that.
Got the right person.
Anyone else who has another concern?
Most of us here are international students. So if the firm is going to sponsor our H-1B visa.
Okay. So a very pragmatic logistics concern. Okay. I'm not sure I'm going to have the answer to the visa solution this evening, but what I do want us to think about, and this is, again, as I said, I'm deliberately going to step down into this narrow discussion of the example topic, but then I want to bring it back out and talk about relationships with people and how we interact with people even when we think we don't have a reason. And as a quick example of that, as I was here a little bit early this evening, and I was people watching, and I like to do that, and overhearing some conversations. And I heard a very nice conversation. Two people met, and one said, "Oh, I know someone who's working on exactly that same thing. I have to put you two in touch." And I thought, well, that's great. And obviously, if that happens, if two people are working on some exact same thing and they don't know each other and some third person can connect them, I think that's great. You should connect them. But I, at the same time, had the thought, well, a lot of times we're afraid to reach out to people because we don't have that specific thing to cause an interaction, to say, I'm working on the same thing you're working on. And it just feels kind of weird. I want us to get over that because that's going to be part of the homework. So what is planning really? Now, I chose this sort of clumsy phrasing, figuring it out. And why? I mean, maybe if I said problem solving, that would sound a little more eloquent. But that isn't what I mean. A lot of planners, so I spoke to some planners and to some engineers before I arrived here this evening. But of course, I've been working with planners and engineers for a couple of decades. And one of the distinctions that planners will be quick to make about engineers is that engineers are trained problem solvers. Handed a problem, and it's your job as an engineer to come up with an innovative solution. So then what are planners doing? Well, planners are the ones who are kind of dropped into the mess of imperfect information, incomplete information, a mix of conversations about things that don't seem to make sense, and have to figure out what everybody's talking about, help everybody facilitate this discussion, help everybody work together so that the first step, because what do engineers need if they're problem solvers? Well, they need a problem to solve. So one has to define a problem. Many problems. There's many problems to be defined, and how you define it depends on, it will affect, what the solution is going to be, who's going to be involved. There will be instant biases. So that's sort of the why I've chosen this clumsy idea of figuring it out. But it's especially important when it comes to sustainability. Because think of how many discussions there are and how many topics there are. And if you just type the word sustainability into the Google machine, how many articles you're going to get on such varied topics. And are you going to gravitate just to the ones that are of interest to you? Just to the ones that you think are related to a job that you're going to get or a job that you're going to do? You have to be willing to think outside everything that you think about day to day. And so, as a planner, when one goes to school to be a planner, it's generally the training is to work in the public sector. And so for those planners nowadays who have degree programs in sustainability and related master's programs, which is a little more specific than just urban planning. When I was in school to be in urban planning, the idea was, of course you're going to be sustainable. You're concerned with the health, safety, and general welfare of the public, and it's all about the public interest. But now we have more happening. And over the last 10 years especially, and we can say this might be related to funding in different government programs and natural disasters that have occurred, planners in public agencies now have this opportunity to be really thinking about sustainability policy. So this is sort of the first time in the past 10 years that you actually see more than comprehensive plans. It used to be before I was in the private sector, I worked for a county upstate, and the idea was comprehensive planning. It was developing a vision statement with the community. What do you want to be in 20 years? Creating policy for that. That policy would guide development decisions. It would also guide zoning, so things that people think about when they think of planning. And it would all be very reasoned, but again, health, safety, general welfare. But now we have policy that's specifically related to the waterfront, to resiliency for buildings. That one NYC, the Plan for a Strong and Just City, and I admit I'm a little New York-centric because I'm in New York and working in New York, but that's one, come back to that one if you're not already familiar with it, because the idea of sustainability as something that is more than natural systems, but also about social equity, about who has transportation access, who between jobs and where they live. That's actually an element of sustainability. So all of these things together, and where do they live in terms of in a coastal zone? Are they protected? You know, we're in the Northeast where we have a lot of attention and we have some political clout and we have money when it comes to combating a lot of things. And we can entertain, as a broader community, very big ideas. We can pay public planners to be thinking about these big ideas. That's not necessarily the case in the middle of the country. In the middle of the country, or the West, I mean, the West might have similar powers, but different issues. Fires, mudslides, earthquakes, all these sort of natural systems. But the idea of equity and how the public is managed, and part of the planning process is it's sort of a new thing in the public realm. So think of the public sector planners as kind of at the forefront of thinking, of thought leadership. And then what about the private? All right, well, those of us planners who work in the private sector are not developing policy. We're working primarily alongside engineers and on very focused projects. So what that means is that we are working with the engineers who come up with these innovative solutions to really tricky problems. And we might have experience with those engineers on some really at the forefront of thinking in terms of engineering. And when you think back to what Michael Tumulty presented to you about Coney Island Yard, you know, that's innovative. How do you deal with the bridges? How do you deal with the infrastructure that's there? How do you, we'll talk a little more about that, but that's experience that engineers have, that private sector planners translate into public documents and to public review, and then communicate back to their public sector planners, friends. The sad thing, it's not really sad, we're working on it. We have very active organizations, the American Association, American Planning Association, for example, a very robust, very large organization, and planners from all around the country get together at least once a year and discuss the work that everybody's doing. But there's, in practice, this sort of disconnect between what the public sector planners are doing, are paid to do on a day-to-day basis, produce these great plans, and what the private sector planners are doing on a day-to-day basis, which is going to entail what you're going to see here in a minute. The thing to consider here is, and this is something that's going to relate to your homework that I'm about to give you, is the idea of projects. And remember, I said engineers need a problem to solve. Well, these problems, think of these as projects, right? So in the public sector, we have policy. Politicians, planners, public agencies are working together to identify needs, to identify, back to the figuring it out, what do we want to focus on? What do we as an agency have jurisdiction to focus on? And then, what do we want to strategically attack first? How are we going to address it? And then come up with a budget for it, and then a capital plan, and then pretty soon the capital plan leads to projects. So that's the translation from the public sector to the private sector. It really is following policy into its translation through money into projects. So that in the private sector, the way we work is the public sector will issue requests for proposals, and it's for a project, and different companies, engineering companies, will compete to win this work. The project could be build a flood wall around something because the agency has determined that the flood wall is important. And then the engineering sector will say, well, this is how we're going to do it. This is the innovative way we're going to handle it. This is how much it's going to cost, and so forth. So that's how we address projects when it comes to the public and, or at least the private sector. Now, environmental planning, just want to bring this in here because it would be very easy to say every planner is an environmental planner. And be very easy to say everybody who is a sustainability planner is an environmental planner. And that is true. Environmental planners, at least in urban areas and in the private sector, have been given this title to sort of distinguish them from the other kinds of planners that engineering firms typically have. And these are transportation planners. So we have environmental planners who deal with land use issues and who deal with environmental review, who deal with sustainability projects, who work hand in hand with the engineers on these kinds of things. And then we have transportation planners who deal with operations planning and basically designing systems for new bus networks, new bus systems, new rail systems. The engineers then are concerned with the infrastructure. We work together, but it's historically kind of what that distinction means. But because of that distinction, in the private sector, the environmental planners end up doing environmental review. Now again, this is something that's kind of dry. For people to do it, it could be kind of fun, but it's not necessarily going to be exciting for people who don't do it on a day-to-day basis. But the idea is environmental review. So is anybody familiar with the term EIS or environmental impact statement? Okay. That is environmental review as an example. The idea is that agencies are in charge of public resources. And these projects that we talked about, that they have to define with their policy, they need to be demonstrably in the public interest. We're spending public money on it. We're using public resources. That could be land, could be public land. We are developing new infrastructure, public infrastructure. We could be modifying it. Anything to do with the public and the public interest, we need to evaluate it. And there's the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, or State Environmental Quality Review Act in New York State. New Jersey has EO 215, Executive Order 215, which is interesting because it's similar to NEPA. It's a little more, none of them are as rigorous as the City Environmental Quality Review, which was developed specifically for New York City, which tells you piece by piece how to analyze things. Some technical areas very prescriptive, some not. Traffic error and noise, for example. How does one analyze traffic impacts? Very prescriptive. But the general idea is, again, discretionary actions. So any agency that has to make a decision about something, so we're not talking permits. We're talking about, a board has to decide whether or not it's in the public interest. So that's the first point. The second point is, a lot of people, when they first encounter planners in the private sector and environmental planners and environmental review, think, oh, okay, well, this is all environmental planning is. And this is why I want to point out that it's not, because environmental review focuses very specifically on not making things worse. One is projects get credit for, benefits, but once it's determined that there's a sound purpose and need, meaning we can demonstrate there's a need for the project, and we can demonstrate that there's a very clear purpose for this project that very much narrows the definition of the project, then presumably it's in the public interest, and making it happen is good. But it has the potential for adverse impacts on the social environment, on the natural environment, the physical environment. And so the idea is to work with the designers to avoid or minimize these impacts, or if it comes right down to it, disclose them and provide mitigation. So it's also a transparency and public disclosure process. Now, it's also a public engagement process, too, because there's prescribed points at which the public interacts. So there's different types. There's EISs, environmental impact statements, or environmental assessments, or categorical exclusions. All these types of documents are the same things as, they're really processes, right? And what they result in is a record of decision or a finding of no significant impact. You're going to hear all these things, and a lot of times people get really focused and think it has to be, they're always looking for one or the other. It's up to the environmental planners to work with the agencies to figure out what actually applies. But for example, Coney Island Yard, it's an MTA project, but it would be receiving federal funding from FTA. So NEPA applies. And so the process is working with FTA to determine what level of environmental review is appropriate. Now, the engineers are busy coming up with solutions. The instant this hits, because it's an exciting project, and I'm sure Mr. Tumulty, explained. It's exciting for what the project is. On some hands, on some level, it's a little intimidating for what it is. I think it excites a lot of engineers because I believe it's the world's largest rail yard, if not that, the largest in the country. It's actually 3 different rail yards. It's a complex. But from an environmental planner's point of view, an environmental review, we take a very dispassionate and cold look at this. We don't get excited about the innovation. It's our job not to be excited about the innovation. It's our job to force the engineers, so this is how the engineers will have to interact with the planners. The planners will constantly be asking why. Why do you need to do it this way? Is this the best way to do it from an engineering perspective? Is there no other way? Is it infeasible to do it any other way? Show me that this is the right way to do it. And we do that every step of the way as we go through various technical areas. So again, this is a categorical exclusion, which is not an EIS. It's not an exhaustive public process because, in fact, it's an improvement to an existing rail yard, a fairly massive improvement, but to an existing rail yard that got development that occurred around the rail yard afterward. And per FTA's guidance, we proceeded with categorical exclusion. It doesn't mean that it's a less rigorous review. What it means is that it's just a different process. Starts with the fundamentals, the project description. So the engineers are going to have to explain to the planners every single thing in plain language that is going to be done for the project. In this case, there's a flood wall, perimeter protection. There was also the pumping systems, I think some of you remember. And then the innovative cantilever systems that lift critical infrastructure at times. I'm just going to focus on a few of these, just so you kind of get a sense at how planners. The first thing, I mean, obviously it's in a flood zone. typically when it comes to new infrastructure projects, one of the first things one has to do is evaluate alternatives. Well, in this case, the site itself kind of presents a problem. That's why it is a resilience project. That's why it's a flood protection project. But we can't, it's just not feasible. It's not reasonable or feasible to imagine that we could relocate this rail yard to some other location in the city. So unfortunately, a lot of, and this is true for a lot of rail infrastructure throughout the country, it's built in the areas that are flat, which happen to be floodplains, built in areas that once upon a time were industrial waterfronts. People didn't want to be at the waterfront. It was supposed to be industrial, and that's how cities developed. So that's where a lot of our critical infrastructure is. And so that's why, and this is why I'm choosing this example of Coney Island Yard this evening, because it's a very, not only am I talking about a very narrow idea of what environmental planning is through environmental review, but it's a really narrow review or idea of what resiliency is. It is very specifically hardening of existing critical infrastructure. That is just a small part of the bigger conversation that you guys should be having or thinking about when it comes to resilience and sustainability overall. So, okay, so we acknowledge that it's in a flood zone. Engineers have to explain this to me. You don't need to look in detail at what it is. Mike already explained it all, but the idea is there's a lot going on, and you would be surprised at how many back and forths the engineers have amongst themselves and with the clients about what is the best solution here. They're trying to deal with drainage, but the water table is just below the surface. So how are they going to pump things out? Well, they want to pump things to the river, Coney Island Creek, which is to the lower right there. Yeah. But that requires permits. That's an issue. There's wetlands. Just pumping rail yard water into the creek automatically isn't great. There's going to have to be filters and so forth and concern and things related to that. But it's a really big yard. And when we look at it from a planner's point of view, it's just how it fits into the development pattern. Mind you, planners, if you're ever working with planners, please be sure your drawings are always up is north, because we have trouble reading the other ones. So this is north is up there. And if you look, I don't think I can I point? No, maybe I can't. All right, so to the upper left, we have, in our vicinity, this big rail yard. We have Coney Island Creek. We have a bridge coming across it. We have John Dewey High School. We have public open space. We have public housing. We have a long expanse of proposed wall alongside Shell Road and the elevated subway. We have a ball field here. And then we have the Keyspan site, which was at one time an environmental remediation site. So we have all these things going on adjacent to it that we have to be concerned with. And so I'm going to focus on just a couple of things that are part of the planning conversation when we come to environmental reviews. So the first thing most people, when environmental review it's about public review, right? So the first thing people want to know is, well, what is this thing going to look like? So we have to take there's no liberties in terms of stylization, but we are concerned with general massing, impressions, and so forth. So this is, for example, on Shell Road, what the wall would look like. Well, what is environmental review concerned with? It's concerned with, I think I mentioned earlier, about not making things worse. And what does that mean? And looking at it from all these different perspectives. What one is looking at in the view on the left are the existing conditions, and it's just a view into a rail yard. And per city seeker standards, that's not an especially important view. We're not looking at something that's historic. We're not looking at a park, except where we are near a park. So now it's a wall. So I'm not going to pose whether or not this is better but it's arguably not worse. Until we get into these tricky little spots. So this was something that, and this is a good example of environmental review. It kind of, it steps off into multiple directions. There's different consultations that have to happen. One is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and it's not uncommon for industrial sites to have historic properties. And these are two National Register Historic Properties, and Mike probably told you about them. I'm going to show you pictures. But one is a traction motor shop. It's used. It's part of their critical infrastructure. It's where they repair trains and motors. And the next is a little gatehouse. Let me see if I can, I'm not there yet. Okay. Here's a little gatehouse. Cute. It's not critical. It doesn't have any absolute function anymore. So now we have to consider, how is that wall that we saw a moment ago going to interact with these historic structures? And it's not up to us, the environmental planners, but per the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, we're going to have to consult with the State Historic Preservation Officer. To do that, we need the engineers and the architects to propose alternatives. Again, what do they absolutely need to do? What is the correct, what is the most efficient engineering solution? And what are some options? So that was the gatehouse that we looked at just a moment ago. This is the traction motor shop. This is very often the case. One can look at this and say, well, that doesn't look special. It doesn't look like a historic church. It's significant for, and I forget which criterion, but I'm imagining it's for you'll notice the sawtooth skylights on the rooftop. It was a type of manufacturing building that was innovative at the time. And I'm not saying that you couldn't see these elsewhere. If you take New Jersey Transit, you can probably see these alongside the railroad in other locations. But it's important here. And it even it's even been modified. So where it's pointing out the infill, those used to be bays. It's now brick. It was bricked over as part of routine operations. But now FTA is involved in funding this project that involves a big wall. So now we have to consider it differently. It's not just MTA bricking over some things and making it more useful. So Michael Tumulty explained all this to you. I'm not going to. But they evaluate the different levels of protection that might be necessary. That's part of a discussion. To what degree do they want to protect these structures? And do they want to protect them at all? So that one of the solutions, in fact, is leaving this little gatehouse outside the wall, so it would not be protected by the wall during a flood event. Again, it's not critical infrastructure. But what does that give us? It means that it's also not hidden by a wall as part of the streetscape. It now continues to contribute to the streetscape, which admittedly it might be a little overwhelmed by the overhead subway line, but it's there. So the architects, the engineers have to prepare drawings, and it always seems like a little bit extra because the architects and engineers think they're going to charge ahead with their one great idea. But the planners are going to make them propose multiple solutions so that this can all be presented to the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Officer, so that we can make the argument, yes, we've looked at the alternatives. These are the different ways that it could be done. This is the best way. Sorry. For example, one of the ways, and this is really kind of interesting, and I didn't mean to skip over it, but the large machine shop, traction motor shop, actually in the final scheme becomes part of the flood wall itself. So then the discussion is how? How is it going to be, because it's right at the property line, and there's no reason to expect that it's appropriate to take DOT property and build a wall on the outside. You have this building right here. Can you just take its existing walls and make them stronger somehow? So the engineers and the architects go through different iterations of how to do this. Do you strengthen it from the outside? Do you strengthen it from the inside? What is it going to look like in the end? Because SHPO wants to know all of this. So it's a fairly succinct report, but with lots of diagrams prepared specifically for this report by the engineers and the architects. So I haven't covered everything, but we look at this, we're concerned about aesthetics, also environmental justice. I didn't really touch on that one, but remember there's the Marlborough houses there. So environmental justice communities are minority populations or low-income populations. One's also concerned with limited English proficiency populations. And this is how one handles outreach and makes sure they're engaged and the process is disclosed to them as well. The public open space, look like I'm heading on 40 minutes, so I'm going to kind of wrap up here. So we look at it from all these different perspectives. And the idea, it happens kind of abstractly when it's the engineers and planners working on this together. And then you see, we need renderings, okay? What is it going to look like? Well, that's what they said it's going to look like. And lo and behold, it pretty much looks like that. So this is the project under construction now, and those are the Marlborough houses to the left. And you'll see it's not quite the imposing, it's a pretty imposing wall, but it's not quite the imposing wall it might have seemed like it could have been. But it kind of fits with the renderings. And there were different treatments as well, different treatments considered depending on the streetscape, open space, and again, that was sort of existing, that was the temporary flood protection that was in place. And then this was a rendering of, this part's not yet been constructed, but a rendering of what this would look like there. Okay. So what we've seen is the environmental review process and the related processes, Section 106, Section 4F, which I didn't really talk about, but we can if you want. It leads to this other aspect of environmental planning through environmental review, and that is the opportunity for the planners to be working with the engineers and the architects to refine the project design, again, to avoid or minimize impacts. How do we incorporate that building, the historic building, in terms of construction near schools or parks? How do we time construction so that it's not necessarily going to be interfering with activities, especially school activities, but also the use of the parks? So there's this opportunity for planners and engineers to be working together in this very narrow way. So I've drilled all the way down to this very specific thing that is a very narrow project that involved my time and Mike's time and many engineers, and it still involves many engineers. But how is that part of the great big conversation about resilience and sustainability? And this is, when I was setting this up, I was thinking, okay, I can provide you a little example of environmental review. It'll bore you to death, possibly, but you should know it because it might be your first introduction to planning work someday, and you need to be prepared for it. People are going to ask you questions, and they're going to expect reasons and logical conclusions. But really, a lot of you, when you do get those jobs right out of school, or the jobs you have now, you will be focused on something fairly specific. You might be working at a campus, you might be dealing with building commissioning, you might be something related to a campus lead certification maintenance kind of program, or something that's kind of narrow. And what I would like is for everybody to be thinking about everything else, because what you are doing every day in your professional lives might not be that great big exciting policy work that some of those few public sector planners get to work on. So how are you going to do that? It goes back to the idea of relationships. So as part of your homework, I'm going to start with the question. How many of you are part of professional organizations right now? All right, so quite a few. What are these professional organizations in the back?
Board of New York, New Jersey.
Okay, and?
American Society of Civil Engineers.
All right, ACC.
SWANA, the Solid Waste Association North America.
Okay, That's quite a diverse array of groups. Who else do we have? What was that? Okay, and you? You have a huge list. All right, but remember this, because when you graduate, his list should come with you. Think about all these organizations, because these are the ways that you're interacting with all these people. And I think personally you should be interacting with planners. So I don't have actually a plug in the slide here, but the American Planning Association. There are divisions that are technical divisions, social divisions, chapter divisions that are geographic, but when you're involved in these groups, with these groups of people all around the country, you suddenly are part of broader conversations that, one, kind of keep your professional life exciting, but two, every one of you in this room, you should be working on your professional relationships with each other too, because as you get older, your careers are going to evolve, and you don't know where you're going to end up. You don't know who is going to be a client for whom, or who needs a job where, or who is going to have an interesting idea unrelated to the work you're doing maybe right now today or right out of school. So for homework, remember what I said about following money. If you go to, how many of you are familiar with the 100 Resilient Cities project? Okay, not enough.
Isabel Beltran was here last year.
Okay. So Rockefeller Foundation sponsored this amazing project, and it just wrapped up basically its sort of initial phase in July. And that's 100 resilientcities.org. And if you go online and look at the different projects that have been undertaken at these 100 cities, even if it's a place you don't plan on working, if it's something that's, you have to start somewhere, so maybe start with the things that do interest you, but reach out to some of the people that have worked on this. You don't have to have a reason. You're here, you're in school, you have an interest, you just want to start a dialogue. You would be absolutely surprised how many people are willing to have an email correspondence with you without you looking for a job. You don't need to be looking for a job. You don't need to have a question related to a specific project. You could just say, hey, I saw this work you did, it's really interesting. Could you maybe direct me to a little more information? I have a similar project, or I'm considering something. I know this sounds unfocused, but that's the whole point. I want everybody to look at the different plans, 100resilientcities.org, or even the New York one I pointed out earlier, the One NYC. Not sure what the website is. It's just One NYC. Have to Google it. But within there, like in probably page 400 or something, there's a list of strategic actions, and it identifies the agencies. So for any of you who have colleagues working at New York City DEP or any of the New York City agencies, DPR, Department of Parks, Recreation, look in there to see what some of those interesting projects are that are part of the sustainability goals that the city has set. And reach out to them and say, hey, how can I be part of that? Or what can you tell me about that? And you might be surprised. There might be a job in it for you. There might not. But it's part of this ongoing personal, professional development that you're going to have to do forever. So that's my long-winded speech about how I think you should develop yourselves professionally. I hope I've given you a slight introduction to what environmental planning is, so that you're not shocked someday when you meet an environmental planner, and an idea of what environmental review is, because any of you who are working on any sort of capital project, it doesn't need to be a resilience project, you will encounter that. So with that, I'm going to open it up to any questions that we might have. Thank you.